The Prophet Muhammad said, "The preserved cities are four. The protected cities are four. The sacred cities are four. Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, and Najran." This is the Polymath Podcast with Dr. John Andrew Morrow. Please like, subscribe, and share. Are the copies of the covenants we have today faithful replicas of the original covenants that the Prophet and the first caliphs of Islam issued to the non-Muslim communities of their time? Ask Ibrahim Zain and Ahmed el-Wakil. The answer to this question, they assert, is a categorical yes. As they summarize, all historical sources, both Muslim and non-Muslim, are in complete agreement that the Prophet and the early Muslims issued treaties to the non-Muslim populations of their time. This historical fact is a shared historical memory, which cannot be disputed. The covenants of the Prophet, both in content and artistic form, are testaments to the tolerance of incipient and emergent Islam, a sentiment that ebbed and flowed and that waned and crest over the centuries. From the earliest to the latest accounts, the best of Muslims behaved benevolently towards Christians. From the 7th century to the 1st century, the Greek Orthodox Church has upheld the authenticity of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad. As His Eminence Archbishop Makarios of Qatar asserted, the Greek Orthodox Church upholds the authenticity of covenants of Muslim rulers issued mainly to Christian clergy, which had the purpose to protect monasteries, churches, and communities. While the covenants of the Prophet have had their detractors among religious authorities and lay scholars, even academics hostile to Islam have begrudgingly admitted that the covenants of the Prophet were respected by some rulers. As Pierre Bayle conceded in his entry on Muhammad in the 1696 Historical and Critical Dictionary, the Greek churches, as well as the Orthodox and Schismatical, have been preserved to this day under the yoke of Muhammad, and that the Turks tolerate all sorts of religions. And if the covenants of the Prophet had opponents, they always had their defenders. For Dimitrios Kalomirakis, the emeritus director of Christian antiquities of the Greek Ministry of Culture, there is no doubt that Muhammad established a huge legislative framework during the last 10 years of his life, orientated at the coexistence of the nations of the Holy Bible, and which aimed at restricting all manner of possible conflict between them. The covenants of the Prophet do not belong in a cabinet of curiosities, nor do they belong in the recycling bin of forgeries. They are reminders of the universal humanistic principles preferred by the Prophet Muhammad during his decade in Mecca, ideals that, Halim Ran reminds us, were never abandoned after his migration to Medina. Although Ran recognizes that the historical Sharia that we inherited, which was developed by medieval jurists, is inconsistent and incompatible with current standards of human rights, he feels that the future of Islam must be founded on a critical re-evaluation of the Quran, the covenants, and other original texts. The consequence of this approach that reprioritizes the fundamental sources of Islam is not lost on Jason Well. In fact, he believes that research in favor of the covenants of the Prophet could substantially revise many scholars' understanding not just of Muhammad's relationship to Christians, but of early Islam and other religions. This is not a criticism that is exclusive to Islam. Western law and the laws of most nations did not live up to the standards of modern human rights. Just like Western Christian laws evolved, so must Eastern Islamic laws in line with the evolution of human knowledge, consciousness, justice, and compassion. More than mere treaties, compacts, and letters, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad are sacred icons that should be revered and revived. Dismissing them as dubious without even engaging in the arguments in favor of their authenticity is lazy and unbecoming of scholars and historians who are supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Obviously, the same criteria should be expected of Islamic clerics and scholars. Religion is not written in stone. Unless it lives, breathes, grows, evolves, and adapts, religion becomes outdated, obsolete, and destined for extinction. For Ibrahim Zayn and Ahmed el-Wakil, reverting to simplistic explanations that do not engage with the arguments that have been presented, and that deliberately manipulate the historical data to advance a particular agenda, falls into the realm of academic dishonesty. As they explain, mainly based on an unwillingness to question the accepted narrative that they are forgeries, the enduring study of the covenants in silos, and prejudice against the covenants because of their obvious implications. It is no secret that there has been a dominant narrative of Islam being a fundamentally intolerant religion, but the covenants clearly show that there is a precedent for peaceful coexistence despite wrongdoings which were committed in Islamic history. Consequently, the covenants set the stage for reviving the tradition of formulating peace agreements based on justice and mutual respect. Unless critics can point by point refute or address all of the arguments which we have presented in defense of the historicity of the covenants, then their categorical dismissal has to be rejected as contrary to critical scholarship. No doubt there are questions that remain unanswered when it comes to the development and writing of Islamic history, questions for which perhaps we will never obtain an answer. But these anomalies are no grounds for rejecting the covenants as it stands, and unless new evidence suggests otherwise, their attribution must be deemed correct. Notwithstanding the transmission nuances, these extant sacred documents are exactly what they claim to be. For Ibrahim Zayn and Ahmed el-Wakil, 10 criteria argue in favor of the historicity and overall textual accuracy of the covenants of the Prophet, contemporary historical writings. 2. The structure of the covenants. 3. Accurate dating. 4. Archaeological evidence. 5. Textual parallelism between covenants given to different religious communities. 6. Textual parallelisms between the covenants and Islamic texts that non-Muslim communities would not likely have known. 7. Shared historical memory. 8. Eyewitness accounts of the original covenants. 9. References to the covenants in the Hadith literature. And 10. Recognition of the covenants by Muslim authorities. Finally, and most importantly of all, it is essential to distinguish between a text and the historical event upon which it is based. Are the covenants of the Prophet the words of Muhammad ipsissima verba? Do these documents contain his verbatim words? That is a matter of debate and one that is impossible to win. It simply cannot be proven. It is a matter of faith as opposed to fact. Do the covenants of the Prophet convey the commands of Muhammad ipsissima vox? While they are not autographs, namely original documents written in the hand of the Prophet, or word-to-word literal transcripts, an argument can be made that they convey the true content of his voice and teachings as transmitted by companions, scribes, and copyists down the centuries. Such a position is perfectly plausible from a scholarly perspective. If, as Milka Levy-Rubin has argued, a comparative legal history is required to establish the authenticity of documents in literary transmission, the distinctive use of the Dhimmatullah formula in the Prophet's documents suggests that it is archaic. The security of God and of his messenger is attested in papyrus and carved in stone. These documents predate the definitive association of Islam with a confessional identity that was universally available. As Sarah Mirza has shown, the Dhimmatullah formula from the Prophet's documents is an artifact of this earlier Arabian polity. For her, this expression is primarily socio-political and economic, with religion remaining peripheral. As she explains, the terms of the Prophet's Dhimma agreements reflected the rules that established political considerations according to the ancient Arabian model. The difference in terms granted to each community reflected not confessional identity, but strategic value. The goal was ambitious, controlling the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. As she explained, the use of the Dhimmatullah formula in widely varying types of documents attributed to the Prophet is not due to randomness or inconsistency. The apparent wide-ranging use of the formula in documents granted to towns surrendering militarily, in land grants, safe conducts, and declarations of sanctuary alerts us to its precise function in formulating inviolability within an intertribal confederation under the aegis of a deity. While there seems to be no direct precedent for it, the Dhimmat Allah formula shares both grammatical form and vocabulary with legal formulae related to political unification and inviolability from ancient South Arabia and Nabatea. Treating the Dhimmat Allah formula in the Prophet's documents as a clause granting personal inviolability within political confederation, and taking into consideration that its distinctive mark in the early usage is the provision of the security of God to Muslims and non-Muslims alike, allow us to identify its function with precision, as it binds various semi-autonomous territories under the Prophet and Allah. It resembles the ancient Arabian Confederation formula used to mark the boundaries of a political complex patronized by a deity. Mirza then notes that R.B. Sargent's observation that the reference to Ummah or community in the Constitution of Medina, and certainly in the Covenants of the Prophet, is to the customary law of confederation along a secular pattern in ancient Arabia. From a codicological, archaeological, and historical point of view, we cannot ask for better than the convergence of evidence from various fields confirming the fact that the Prophet Muhammad protected both Muslims and non-Muslims. And while one has every right to doubt the literal and literary fidelity of the covenants of the Prophet, there is no reason to doubt the historical events upon which they are based, namely, Muhammad's encounter with Christian monks and communities and his desire to protect the people of the book. Despite efforts to strangulate and suffocate the original Islam of love, mercy, kindness, and compassion, the covenants of the Prophet with the Christians have survived, and their original sense can be recovered. In fact, as Halim Braun's study has found, in spite of their centrality and significance in the Quran and Sunnah, observes Ron, covenants remain understudied and underrepresented in discourses about Islam today. In fact, he laments the fact that a covenantal theology was never developed by Islamic scholars, past or present, and that covenants have not been treated as a discrete category in Islamic scholarship, including the Quran, commentaries, hadith compilations, theological treatises, or legal manuals. Since covenants permeate the Quran and are central to the Quranic narrative of human existence and coexistence, Ron is convinced that without an explicit focus on covenants, Islamic studies is seriously deficient. What is more, he argues that the corruption, disharmony, and oppression that ensues from the violation of covenants and treaties represents proof of the indispensability of covenants and treaties for peaceful and secure human existence and coexistence. If scholars like Ron argue that the covenant verses constitute the maqasid al-Quran, namely the higher objectives of the Islamic scripture, others perceive them as central principles of religious pluralism that should form a fundamental part of interfaith dialogue. As Muhammad bin Ali argues, the foundation for all religious communities worldwide is based upon common moral principles that have universal appeal and humanistic values. As such, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, recognized the value of enhancing interfaith relations, as this would mean strengthening the morality base in the world. This becomes pertinent in a world that is becoming more secular, divisive, and has largely lost its moral grounds. Muhammad becomes an excellent model of interfaith interaction that fulfills Diana X's religious pluralism criterion. When he opened the doors of his place of worship to the Christians to pray, he was creating a vision for his ummah to embrace and welcome religious diversity. His hospitality and care extended to all strangers and guests and portrays the value of emotional intelligence as a priority in all human interaction, including interfaith relations. Muhammad has proven that reaching a pluralistic state or mindset in an interfaith relation is built upon genuine social interactions and the building of an authentic relationship. As much as interfaith dialogue is important, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad are prime examples of religious pluralism. As far as he is concerned, the mere fact that a nation is predominantly Muslim does not imply that it is to be Islamic. For it to be fully Islamic, it must consciously turn towards civic rights and religious pluralism. For other academics like Sayyida Ujala Zahid and Hafsa Ayaz Qureshi, the covenants of the Prophet should not be restricted to interfaith relations. They should offer advice to government, civil society actors, and policymakers to promote social integration of religiously diverse communities. Most importantly, they stress that, in a world where sectarian violence and religious intolerance are on the rise, the principles found in the writings of the Prophet Muhammad offer guidance and hope for building more inclusive and compassionate societies. For some scholars, it would seem, the Quran, the Constitution of Medina, and the covenants of the Prophet are not calling for the creation of some sort of Islamic state, but rather are the founding blocks of a secular confederation. Said Arjoman, the sociologist, described the Prophet's polity as a pax islamica of an intertribal security system. Not only did it not require profession to Islam, but it included protectorates that consisted of Jews and Christians. Rather than signify believers, he believes that the term mu'minun carries the sense of those faithful to the covenant, which was initially distinct from the term muslimun or Muslims. Other scholars like Ismail Adaramola, Abdulaziz, and Muhammad Afiduddin place the covenants of the Prophet conspicuously in the category of akhlaq or applied ethics. In their view, the value of the covenants lies in their moral authenticity and their virtue. The covenants do not simply provide theoretical possibilities of Muslim and Christian coexistence, they are, on the other hand, historical realities that provide a framework on which future prospects can be envisaged for Muslim and Christian understanding. The rediscovery of these documents provides an opportunity to give new birth to Islam and regenerate the essence of Islamic teachings. Prophet Muhammad developed a democratic aptitude toward Christian societies. The Prophet's relationships with Christians can be characterized by more than mere tolerance, but rather by compassion and the fostering of peace. The covenants convey a common message of dignity and equality and help to minimize the scope and scale of current polarization between Muslims and Christians in the Middle East and beyond. For Muhammad Junaid and Jamil Ahmad Sindhu, the covenants of the Prophet manifest the inclination of the Holy Prophet towards peace, security, religious freedom, and mutual coexistence. The fact remains that the Quran, the Messenger of God, and the covenant of the Prophet do not merely speak of tolerating others. They call upon Muslims to love them. As objective and impartial academics concur, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad have become a valuable heritage in Islam, serving as inspiration across various aspects of human interactions, including social, moral, and economic spheres. The principles found in this heritage are indeed universal and could enhance the current policies of various nations worldwide. They are grounded in justice and equity, fostering a fair and balanced society. For Llanos Liantes, Muhammad was the guarantor of the security of Christians. Considering that the Constitution of Medina and the various covenants of the Prophet refer to themselves as a Kitab, a term that means book, writing, writ, mandate, scripture, prescript, ordinance, decree, pact, treaty, and constitution, the expression al-Kitab, typically translated as people of the book, meaning the Bible, or for some, the preserved tablet, also conveys the sense of the people of the covenant, namely al-Ahad, which has a dual sense that is both sacred and profane, as well as spiritual and political. Far from rejecting other monotheistic religions, suppressing, supplanting, or superseding them, the Islam of the Quran and the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad covers them in the cloak of God's covenant with creation. As Ahmed el-Wakil, Ibrahim Zain, and Halim Ran have concluded, efforts to dismiss the covenants of the Prophet as forgeries fail to succeed in face of the living tradition. Consequently, the opponents of coexistence were required to create a competing historical text to stand in contrast to the terms and conditions of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians. Since the covenants of the Prophet could not be categorically rejected, they were instead contended. Thus arose the infamous Pact of Umar, which spiraled out of control, spawning repressive legislation aimed at Christian, Jews, and other non-Muslims. There is a deadly disease at the heart of Islam, and the covenants of the Prophet are the cure. Let us keep them alive in theory, faith, and practice.